They said no man could reach a Fuso-class battleship without being seen, yet on a moonless night in the Pacific, a lone United States Navy combat diver slipped beneath the surface and swam straight toward one. He carried no light, no bubbles, and no margin for error. His mission was unthinkable: sever the ship's massive anchor chain in complete darkness and send the giant drifting helplessly into danger. The harbor above him was silent, except for the faint hum of generators vibrating through the water. Those vibrations were the only guide he had. Every stroke drew him closer to the steel hull that towered over him like a wall of cold iron, its crew unaware that a single diver was about to challenge an entire warship. Cutting an anchor chain of that size was nearly impossible under ideal conditions. Doing it blind, under an enemy battleship, required a level of nerve that few men possessed. But the coastline depended on this mission. If the ship remained anchored, the upcoming assault would be met with devastating fire. If it drifted, the path would open. Before the chain snapped, he would discover something the intelligence reports never mentioned, something that would push him to the edge of his limits. Like and subscribe for more true stories from the shadows of history, and keep watching to see what he found waiting beneath the battleship. Jack Merrick had been chosen for this mission not because he was the strongest, but because he could remain calm when the ocean turned unpredictable. Before joining the early American naval demolition units, Merrick had worked as a swimmer in coastal rescue operations, learning to navigate by feel long before he knew what wartime sabotage demanded. When he volunteered for the Navy's newly formed combat diver program, his instructors noticed something rare. Merrick could shut out panic, even when blindfolded and submerged. That skill made him the ideal candidate for operations where sight meant nothing and steady hands meant survival. In the Pacific theater, battleships like the Japanese Fuso class acted as floating fortresses. When anchored in narrow harbors, they created overlapping fields of fire that could stop amphibious assaults before they even began. This particular ship had survived earlier air attacks, its armor scorched but intact, prompting the Japanese to move it behind nets, patrol lines, and shallow water defenses. Every approach to the harbor was watched. Every inlet had been mapped. But defenses built for boats and submarines were not designed for a single silent diver moving along the seafloor. Merrick studied the harbor layout for hours before the mission. He memorized currents, predicted thermoclines, and learned the rhythm of patrol boats circling the channel. The plan required him to swim in with the tide, use the cold layers of water as concealment, and reach the battleship minutes before the patrol loop reset. Everything depended on perfect timing and absolute silence. Merrick reached the battleship's shadow long before he saw any shape above him. The first sign was the vibration, a low, steady thrum running through the water as the ship's boilers and auxiliary generators worked through the night. He let the sound guide him, rising slowly from the cold lower layer until his hands brushed against steel. The hull felt enormous, like touching the side of a building planted in the sea. He moved along its curve carefully, counting each motion, orienting himself by the direction of the hum and the faint pressure changes created by the ship's internal machinery. Then he found the anchor cable. It descended from the bow like a metal spine, thick with algae and hardened salt. He wrapped one hand fully around a link, and his pulse quickened. Intelligence had underestimated its size. A Fuso-class ship was already known for heavy chains, but this one had been reinforced after a recent torpedo scare. The links were broader, denser, and more difficult to cut than expected. Cutting them in darkness would take longer than the plan allowed. Merrick examined the chain link by link, using both hands to measure their width. The tools he carried, a wire saw, a clamp, and two silent-shaped charges, would not break the chain cleanly in one attempt. He would have to weaken the metal manually before using a slow-burn charge to finish the job. That meant more noise risk, more time underwater, and less margin before the patrol boat completed its next pass. Jack Merrick steadied his breathing. He had trained for improvisation, but this would push his limits farther than any drill had prepared him for. Discover next what happens when the patrol route suddenly shifts. Merrick secured himself to the chain with a looped strap, anchoring his body so the surge of water would not tear him away. The first task was weakening the metal by hand. He slipped the wire saw around a link and began drawing it back and forth in slow, controlled movements. The saw had no rattle, no snap. It relied on friction alone, grinding silently into steel. In training, he'd learned that the vibrations of a wire saw could blend into the natural hum of a ship's machinery if he worked at a steady rhythm. Now, with only inches of visibility and the ship looming above, he kept his pace constant, counting each pull in his head. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. His shoulders burned from the restrained motion, but the groove deepened. When the metal had been thinned enough, he paused, wiped away floating grains of steel, and reached for the first of the silent charges. It was a small demolition device designed to burn through metal rather than shatter it. Wrapped tightly around the weakened link, it relied on a chemical ignition that produced almost no sound underwater. He fixed it into position, secured its clamps, and activated the fuse. A faint warmth spread through the water as the charge began to work. He braced himself, gripping a nearby length of chain to steady his body. Above him, searchlights continued to sweep the harbor, their beams diffused by the fog. A patrol boat passed closer than expected, sending its propeller wash rushing downward like a sudden underwater windstorm. The diver tightened his grip as the current tugged at him, threatening to undo all his progress. The slow burn charge continued eating through the final thickness of steel, each second bringing him closer to a point where silence would no longer matter. A deep, muted tremor pulsed through the water as the final layer of steel gave way. It was not a sharp snap, but a heavy surrender, the kind of movement only a massive chain could make when its tension finally broke. The diver felt the vibration run along the links and into his forearms. Above him, the battleship began to shift. At first it moved only a fraction of an inch, but the ocean did the rest. The tide caught the now unrestrained hull and began pushing it sideways, its thousands of tons responding to the gentle but relentless current. On deck, muffled shouts erupted, metal clanged as sailors rushed to stations, unaware that the crisis had begun beneath them minutes earlier. The diver released his strap and drifted backward, careful not to let rising bubbles betray him. The shifting hull distorted the water pressure around him, creating swirling eddies that tugged at his arms and legs. He needed distance, fast, but speed could create trails, and trails could be seen. The battleship's bulk moved across his planned escape path, forcing him deeper. He descended into colder water, using the sharp drop in temperature to mask his presence. Currents pushed debris past him, splinters of wood, flecks of paint, and fragments shaken loose by the ship's sudden movement. He extended one hand to avoid striking the hull. A single accidental knock could echo upward. Searchlights crisscrossed the harbor surface. Patrol craft roared to full power, their engines flooding the water with pulsing vibrations. The diver remained steady, letting the turbulence pass as he eased toward the outer channel. Watch to find out how the mission shaped the future of underwater sabotage. By the time the patrol boats reached the drifting battleship, the damage had already been done. The great hull slid into the shallow outer shelf, where coral and embedded wreckage formed a natural barrier. Its keel scraped, its momentum slowed, and within minutes the ship settled at an angle that made gunnery impossible. No torpedoes had been fired, no bombers had appeared overhead, and no alarms had sounded beforehand. From the outside, it looked as if the sea itself had decided to move the vessel. In the days that followed, American officers studied the event with unusual interest. They recognized that a single diver, working without light and without noise, had accomplished what conventional weapons could not. Reports circulated quietly through early naval demolition units, detailing how he had identified the vessel by vibrations, measured the chain by touch, and employed a slow burn charge to complete the cut without alerting the ship's crew. These observations later influenced procedures inside the developing underwater demolition teams, particularly regarding blind tactile navigation and the controlled use of silent charges. Jack Merrick returned to duty without ceremony. His mission was never recorded in official communiques, and his name never appeared in wartime bulletins. Yet among the small community of men who operated beneath the surface, his work became a reference point, a demonstration of what could be achieved through discipline, precision, and the willingness to operate alone in absolute darkness. The battleship never sailed again, and the coastline once held under its guns open to advancing forces. The quiet success of the mission lived on only in memory. passed between divers who understood how narrow the margin had been and how close the operation came to failure.